So I want to hand this over to our expert on the cost guidance quickly, but really quickly, this is going to be what we're going to talk through today. Walking away from this webinar, we want you to understand why is it that you would go about measuring and looking at the costs associated with your positive youth development program? How can it help you? And then how do you actually do it? What is it that you can learn from doing this type of work? How can it help you in your work in advocating for these efforts and improving the effectiveness or efficiency of the work that you're doing? And then we also want you to know about, we can only cover so much in a 1-hour webinar. What are other resources and types of support that you could access to be able to do this work in practice? And then, like I said, we'll have some good time at the end for questions and discussion. So put those questions in the chat, save them up for the end. And then also, we would love to hear if you have any experience with using cost guidance or cost analysis, even if it's in another sector. How has it helped you in your work? That would be really useful examples to understand, maybe what were challenges that came up when you were actually measuring some of these costs. We would love to learn from you as well about how to do this. All right, we can go on to the next slide. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our expert who's going to be walking us all through the wonderful resources that are available about cost measurement and analysis for positive youth development programs. We have with us Melissa Donaher, who's a MEL specialist at USAID's Center for Education. She's previously worked at Save the Children and the Harvard Graduate School of Education's EASL Lab. She's also one of the authors of this cost guidance on PYD programs. So there is no better person to walk us through these great resources. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining today. I'm really excited to be here with you all and share some information about our approach to cost measurement, which was initially developed by the Center for Education, and talk about how we've adapted that guidance to be used for PYD programming. But before we jump into the content, if you haven't already, please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's joining today, your role, your organization, and where you're coming from. We're also just going to do a quick poll just to get a sense of where people are with this content coming into this call today. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we're going to start with this poll. So the first question is, how familiar are you with cost reporting and analysis? And this is cost reporting and analysis more generally. It doesn't have to be with the specific guidance that we're talking about today. So if you can add your response to the chat, so you can put a 1 if this is something that is totally new to you, a 2 if you have some experience, and 3 if you are very experienced. I'll give everyone a moment to share their number in the chat. I'm seeing some 1s and 2s. So we have some people with experience and some people for whom this is completely new, which is exciting. All right, I think we have a good amount of responses. So yeah, really great to see. And we have 1 person with a lot of experience. Great. We definitely look forward to having you share your experience. So yes, hopefully this will be a good introduction for those of you for whom this is new or you have limited experience. And we'll also make sure to share some additional resources so you can dive in a little bit deeper after the call. All right, if we go to the next slide, we have 1 more poll question for you all, which is, how familiar are you with positive youth development, or PYD? So same scale here. 1, completely new to you. 2, if you have some experience. And 3, I am very experienced. Feel free to put your responses in the chat. All right, I'm seeing again some 1s and 2s. So we have some experience, 2.5, 3. All right, so really a mixed group again, which is exciting. So I think this is great. Yeah, the 2.5. Yeah, so we the reason we ask these two questions is this is really the main focus of this webinar, is about how to apply cost guidance specifically for positive youth development programs. So if you're interested in either of those topics, or you have some experience and are looking to gain more, I think this will be a valuable session for you all. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to talk first about why are we measuring costs? Why do we see this as a valuable initiative at USAID? And so if we go to the next slide again, thank you. So there are two overarching objectives of this work, and they are to improve value for money and sustainability. So what do we mean by value for money? So value for money is about getting the most impact out of our limited resources so that we can reach more people and achieve greater impact. The second one is around sustainability. So we want our investments to make a really lasting impact. And we know that eventually our USAID funding will end at the end of an activity. And so we want to be able to share with partner governments or other stakeholders how much our interventions cost so that they can continue to be implemented, scaled, and sustained in the local context. And so we've seen in our work to date that cost evidence provides really valuable information to decision makers to make really practical decisions related to value for money and sustainability. And so that's why we really see this value in measuring and analyzing cost data. So if you go to the next slide. So here are some examples of the types of questions that we can answer, specifically about PYD programming with cost data. And so as I'm going through these questions, these are sort of general questions, but would really encourage you all to think about some of the programs that you've worked on or you have evaluated as a researcher, and what types of cost questions you might want to ask. And feel free to share those in the chat as we are going through. So the first question is, how much does it cost to achieve the results we want? So for example, how much does it cost to train X number of community health workers? Or how much does it cost to improve employment outcomes? You can also ask about how much does it cost to scale or sustain successful interventions? So to the objective around sustainability, for example, you might want to know for a 5-year activity, in year 2, if you're looking to expand to a new region in the country, cost data can help you better plan for this scale up and sustaining that intervention. How much does it cost to improve outcomes for the most marginalized youth? We know that some youth need more support or resources to achieve the outcomes that we have for a particular activity. And so cost analysis can help us to better understand what are the cost drivers of some of these different interventions, and what does it really take to move the needle for the most marginalized youth. There's another set of questions that cost data can be really helpful with, and that's around context. So how do context features affect cost? We know that the costs of our interventions are determined largely by local pricing. And so the same intervention might be very cost effective in one context, but much less so in another. And so understanding context, you'll see, is a critical component of our approach to conducting cost analysis. And then the final question here is, how do intervention characteristics affect costs? So cost data can help us understand which elements in a package of interventions. And we know in PYD programming, we're often including multiple different interventions. So looking at what are the specific cost drivers of each of those interventions to see if these could be controlled in some way without jeopardizing the integrity of the full intervention. And I'll share later in this session an example of a cost analysis that we've done in the education sector that provided insight into some of these questions. But a key point to make here is that cost data are not there to make good or bad judgments. Cost evidence is meant to be used alongside other important contextual information to inform practical decisions about achieving our development priorities within existing budgetary constraints. So if we click once more, I think we have a few questions on this slide. Would love to hear if people want to take a minute to type into the chat what are some examples? What are some cost questions that you would like to answer about a PYD program that you work on? And how could you use this information to inform decision-making related to sustainability or value for money? So maybe take a minute and just think about these questions and then share your responses in the chat. And maybe another way to think about this question is, how could cost data help you? What would you like to learn if you had more information on the cost drivers or cost analysis? How could you use that to help your decision making? I see a question from Stephanie. How much do costs differ for urban, peri-urban, and rural PYD programs? How could we plan for more appropriate costs in the future? Yeah, that's a great example of thinking about context and how that impacts the cost of different interventions. Camila, what elements do I have to take into account to budget methodology transfers? Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe we could talk a little bit more about sort of unpacking what we mean by that methodology transfers piece. But yeah, this is a great question. That's an example of looking at prospectively, if we wanted to plan for future implementation, we could ask questions like that. Great. So feel free to keep those questions coming throughout the session if you think of others. Hopefully this will spark some ideas that you might have. And so we can go to the next slide. The final piece I just wanted to note here is that there is a requirement, this is specific for USAID funded programs, related to cost analysis. So as of 2020. So there is a requirement through ADS 201 that some cost analysis be included for all external impact evaluations that are conducted using USAID funds. And so what this means is that if any activity is thinking about maybe doing some kind of impact evaluation, it would be beneficial to set up cost reporting at the start of the activity. It's much easier to do it at the start rather than later on. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you would do that at the end of this session. So next slide. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the why and some different questions that we might want to answer. We'll move in now to talk about the how. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see an overview of the different data that we are collecting as part of this cost measurement work. So there are three main types of data. The first is on the left, the implementing partner expenditures of USAID funds. We have a lot more information that we'll go into on the next few slides, but this is the information that probably you think about first when you hear about cost data collection, expenditure data. So I'll talk more about how we collect and analyze that data. But there are two other really important pieces that we want to make sure we are capturing as well. And the second is contributions. So this would be data on contributions which might come from the partner government, the private sector, private individuals, participants themselves who are contributing time to the activity. For contributions, we have two criteria for determining when we should include contributions. And those are that they are both substantial and activity critical. So substantial refers to the amount or the size of the intervention, of the contribution, which will differ, of course, depending on the size of the activity. But we want to make sure that they are substantial, not very small quantities of contributions. And the second is activity critical. So this is related to the importance of the contribution in achieving the activity's goals. So could this activity be implemented without this contribution? If not, then we should be counting that because it is an essential part of the costs that went into achieving the outcomes that we see. And the final piece is really important and also relates to the question of context. So this is about the details of the intervention. So information about the theory of change, the different components of the intervention, dosage, where it was implemented, different geographies, etc. This is really critical information to help put into context the cost of our contributions and expenditures. So for example, if we're looking at a comparative cost analysis of two different soft skills training programs, it would be really important to know how many hours youth spend in each of those two different interventions in order to make sense of the findings, right? And so having information about the details of the intervention is really important in interpreting the contributions and the expenditure data. So it's these three components together that we use to determine the total cost of the intervention. We have a lot more detailed guidance on how to collect all of these in our cost reporting toolkit, which we will share in the chat, as well as some different templates and resources. So we can go to the next slide just to make this a little bit more tangible. So two key things to note about our approach. One is that we have standardized the approach. So over time, we've worked to develop a standard list of cost categories, as well as a number of templates and resources for capturing expenditures, contributions, and intervention details in a standardized way. So this is really important because it not only helps with consistency and comparability across contexts, but also makes it easier for implementers and researchers to do this kind of cost measurement work because they can adapt and utilize our existing resources. So we'll be sharing a number of resources throughout this session. And if you ever have questions, you can reach out to me about that as well. The second point is the real-time data collection. So cost data collection is done concurrently or in real time rather than retrospectively. And we've seen this is really important for ensuring greater accuracy and improving the quality of our data and analysis rather than trying to look back and remember why a certain expense was incurred. It's much easier to set up the systems and collect it in real time. But it's important to note that this approach does not result in a creation of a parallel financial system. We are really leveraging the existing system of financial reporting that all USAID award recipients are already following, and just making some changes to how we categorize and organize those expenditures, which we'll show an example of on the next slide. So it's really not meant to create an additional burden or a separate system, but building on existing systems that are already in place. So we can go to the next slide. And if there are any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand at any point. We will have time at the end as well for more Q&A and discussion, but feel free to interrupt me at any point with questions. Okay, so here's an example of what this looks like in practice for a PYD activity. So the rows in this table, so those are listed on the left, those show the different cost ingredients. So these are the types of different resources that would go into a particular award. These probably look familiar to many of you, as these are the buckets that USAID already uses to capture our expenditures. So things like personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, and other costs. So we already capture this information, but as of now, we don't have a way to see when we look at financial reports, the why behind these expenditures, which is why we need the cost categories. So in the table, you'll see the cost categories are what's listed across the top. These are the why behind a particular expenditure. So why did we hire this person? Why did we purchase this particular piece of equipment? The answers to these questions allow you to organize your expenditures into different cost categories. So every cost should be able to fit into both the what, which is the row, and the why, which is the category. On the next slide, I'm going to give a little bit more detail on the cost categories, and then I can pause at that point and see if there are any questions, because I know this is an important part of the work that we sometimes just get questions about. How do we think about the categories and ingredients? So if we go to the next slide, thank you. So these are the 13 standardized cost categories. The only required category is number 1. The rest will be determined based on the objectives of a particular program or activity. So you wouldn't be reporting on all 13, you would just select the ones that are relevant to you. So the first category is general operations management and reporting. Again, this is the only category that is required. And this is really meant to capture all costs related to USAID funded implementation. So for example, costs related to preparing for USAID reports, finance, security, things like that. We need to be able to capture these costs, but also separate them out because depending on our cost question, we may or may not need to include these costs in our calculation. So for example, if we were trying to ask a question about what would it cost for the partner government to take up the intervention once USAID funding ends, then these would be costs that wouldn't necessarily apply and we wouldn't include in that calculation because they're specific to USAID management of that particular award. The second category is assessments and evaluations. This one is optional, but we see that it ends up being relevant for almost all activities because it includes any kind of assessment or evaluation that's looking at the activity as a whole. So like a final evaluation, for example, or a midterm evaluation. And then categories 3 through 13, these are our technical categories. So you'll note that while these categories were initially developed for the education sector, you'll see through the examples that we'll go through on the next few slides, many of them are also relevant for cross-sectoral PYD programs. But in cases where you might have activities that don't fit into one of these standard categories, there is also an other option, that's number 13, which can be used in that case. Again, this is a menu of options, so you would not be using all of them. You would only select the ones that are relevant for your particular activity. And all of the cost categories also have optional subcategories, which we highly encourage people to use. Again, the subcategories you use really will depend on what you're hoping to learn from the cost analysis. So for example, one common subcategory that we see people using is to separate out costs related to the development of a particular intervention versus the implementation. So for example, if you're developing curriculum materials, being able to separate those costs of developing and writing the curriculum versus actually administering the training that you're using that curriculum for. And that's because if you have a question, again, related to sustainability and continuing the intervention, you likely wouldn't need to incur those costs again of development if you are going to be using the same materials. So it's important to think through what implementation will look like, what will remain, and what would not need to be re-incurred. And so that's why we often encourage that as a subcategory. You can also come up with subcategories that might be relevant aside from the ones that we have listed in our guidance. All right, I'm going to go into an example of PYD, but let me just pause here and see if there are any questions so far.
Hi, Melissa. So there are not any questions in the chat, but I do want to go back to the question that Camilla put into the chat when we were on an earlier slide, where she was asking about budget method, how to budget for methodology transfers. The way I interpreted Camilla's comment was about how do you take an approach that might have worked in one place and bring it to a new country or other context. And that just reminded me of what you were just saying about curriculum development. So you could think from the start, if we want to learn more about how much time and effort and resources it took to account for this transfer, you could include that as one of those columns from the start. Is that how that would work?
Yeah, thanks for this question, and thanks, Camila, for highlighting it. If we go back maybe just to the other slide, and I see Camila saying, yes, that was the question. So the way that we think about this, and we'll get more into sort of the process of it on the next slide, but the columns are the categories, so the why. So the question to ask yourself for all of these columns is, why did we incur this particular expense? So here you'll see we have the sort of light gray color, for example, capacity strengthening of local organizations. So if you have an activity where one of your core objectives is to support capacity strengthening of local organizations, any costs related to that would go under this category. And from there, you would break down costs by ingredient. So for example, you have likely staff who are dedicated to supporting this work. So their salary, or at least the portion of their salary that is dedicated to this work, would go under that row. If you have travel related to that, or equipment and supplies, all of that will go there. So that's hopefully helping to explain sort of this table and the columns versus the rows. But I think Camila's question about sort of thinking about adapting or transfer to a new context is a really important one, and highlights the importance of really clearly defining upfront, what are your cost questions? What is it that you're hoping to do with this information? Because that will influence how you set up your cost reporting. So for example, in the example you gave, Stephanie and Camila, so if you have a curriculum that you've developed in one context, but you're thinking about how might we adapt this program and this curriculum to a new one, you might think about, for example, like I said, separating the costs related to what it took to develop the curriculum and then what it took to implement it. The development piece likely wouldn't need to fully apply in a new context. If you're assuming you can take that curriculum, but maybe then you need to budget something for modifications, which is different than, developing the whole new curriculum. So you would have to sort of think through exactly what is your implementation model and what are you hoping to learn from the cost analysis? What do you expect to stay and what do you expect to not apply? And that would be how you think about what categories and subcategories are important to include in setting up your cost analysis. Hopefully that's helpful. We do have in the guidance some more examples of different subcategories that you might use, as well as categories, of course, when you might use each one. And so that might be helpful in getting at more specifics. But yes, hopefully that helps. If you have further clarifying questions, feel free to jump in, either Camila or Stephanie.
It sounds like, Melissa, one of the big takeaways that I have from everything you've said so far is how helpful it is to have some of these questions in mind from the very start so that you can be collecting this data in an ongoing way. And it sounds like a great way to do that would be as your team is developing a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan, thinking about how those cost questions might show up in a learning agenda question.
Yes, definitely. I think that's a great point as well, to make sure that if you have a learning agenda for your activity, that you are documenting the cost questions there. You'll probably hear me say this throughout this webinar, but the earlier you can start thinking about those questions and setting up the systems to capture data, the better, because it's much easier to set up the system and then collect the data aligned to it, rather than trying to look back and remember sort of why certain expenses were occurred. And so documenting that in your learning agenda and your MEL plan is really a good way to make sure that you're set up for success throughout the process.
That's great. And we did have another question come in. So from Sharika, she sent a question that says, could you say more about how category 2 is defined, about assessments and evaluations? Are there instances where data collection efforts as part of regular implementation activities might fit under a different category?
Yeah, thanks, Sharika. I think this is a good question. And I will say there is, within the guidance, we have very detailed information about examples of what fits into all of these categories. So if you have like a specific question, I always recommend consulting the guidance because it is quite comprehensive. But what I can say sort of more generally is this category 2 is really meant to be assessments and evaluations related to the whole of the activity. So if we think about like a midterm evaluation, a final evaluation, if you're doing like an implementation research, that's looking at the whole of the activity. But there could be some MEL related activities, which I think speaks to your latter point, Sharika, that would actually fit under one of the technical categories. So for example, sometimes we will do observations of our teachers or facilitators. So like classroom observations, which are aimed to inform the development of teaching and learning materials, right? So category 7, if we want to understand, what additional support might teachers need to implement this intervention? If the purpose of that data collection is to inform teaching and learning materials, then it would fit under category 3. It's not really related to broader assessment and evaluation of the activity. So again, I would go back to sort of thinking through the why. Why are we collecting this particular data, or things like that? And that will help you decide if it's really meant to be broader or if it's specific to a particular technical category. Great. Yeah, these are great questions. Feel free to keep them coming. But I think in the interest of time, we can jump to the next slide, because I do want to get into a few PYD specific approaches and examples. So, and this is also in the guidance document, so I'll just go over this briefly, but we tried to think through a few examples of different interventions that are commonly used in PYD programming and some of the standard cost categories that might map to them. Again, these are illustrative, so you always have to go back to asking what are our specific objectives, but just thinking through sort of generally these different approaches. So for example, a program under assets and intervention, which is providing soft skills and work readiness training to youth. So the trainers who deliver the training to youth would first need to receive their own training, right? And so that cost associated with that training would fit under our cost category 6, which is in-service educator training. Another one to call out under contribution, which we know is fairly common with PYD programming, is training of youth leaders. So the example here is in community engagement and citizenship. That would fit under our cost category 11, which is leadership development. And then work around the enabling environment. Again, this is a huge focus, of course, in our PYD programs. So for example, the first example here, strengthening the capacity of youth-led organizations, would connect well to cost category 4, which is capacity strengthening of local organizations. So if we go to the next slide, we wanted to give you all a chance to think through, in this example, which cost categories might apply to this context. So I'm going to read this example of a PYD program and the 3 objectives behind it. And then I'd like you all to share in the chat, what cost categories do you think might apply in this particular context? And if you want to give a brief explanation of why you selected those ones, you can do that as well. And you can write the number of the cost category, and all of those are listed on the right. So a cross-sectoral PYD program has the following 3 objectives. The first is revising the curricula of vocational training centers to emphasize the importance of soft skills and developing teaching and learning materials to reflect the curriculum. So what cost category might apply to part A? You can put that in the chat. B is creating youth-led clubs at vocational training centers to provide a space for youth to learn about and discuss sexual and reproductive health. What cost category or categories might apply here? And then C is improving linkages between vocational training centers and the private sector, including a new internship program. So take a minute to think about this, read them again, and share in the chat, what cost categories do you think would apply for this program?
So looking at this example on the screen that Melissa just read out, does anyone see one of the cost categories that you think would apply for cost data collection for this program?
I'm also, as you're thinking, going to put into the chat an annex that we've developed for our cost reporting guidance, which gives some very detailed examples for each category of the types of activities that may fit under each cost category. So this is a really helpful reference, something that I look at fairly often when I'm starting on a new activity and starting to think through what cost categories might apply. So sharing that for reference. And if you look at page 4, you'll see some of that guidance starting. But I see a couple people are putting in 7. 7 and 8 I've seen so far. Does anyone want to share either in the chat, or you can come off mute, of why you think 7 and 8 would apply for this activity? So 7 is teaching and learning materials, and 8 is safe, inclusive spaces and infrastructure.
Hi, it's Camila. Nice to meet you.
Hi,
I
Camila.
think hi. So I think it's 7 for A, because revising the curriculum, for sure you will need to review teaching and learning materials. So I guess that one goes with that. And I said also B in the letter B, since you need to create youth-led clubs and vocational training centers, and you're talking about like centers, like something physical. I thought about like developing safe, inclusive, and spaces and infrastructure. So that's my bet. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Camila, so much. I had the same thinking when I was reading this. So yeah, 7 and 8, I think, as you described, map really well to A and B, the curriculum work, and then the creation of the youth-led clubs. So those are really great examples. What about for part C? Does anyone have thoughts on what category we might use for part C, which is improving linkages between vocational training centers and the private sector, including a new internship program? Yeah, I see some people are writing 4, 7, 8, 9, 3. Okay, we've got a couple examples here. So 4, I see capacity strengthening of local organizations. So can someone share maybe why you thought 4 might apply in this context?
I said 4. It's Camila again. Sorry. I put 4 because or 4 and 3 actually, because in order to for sustainability, you just have to not only work like with local actors, but if you want a center to stay in time, you will need to have some other partners to work on that. So that's what I thought that was a good option, not only local, but working with the government and systems.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, and definitely recognizing that often a big priority of our work is working closely with local organizations, with the government, as you said, to support our goals related to sustainability. So I think that's a really good point. Maybe if we can just click through so I can show you the answers I came up with. And again, this is just based on my own reading of this very limited information that we have here as an example. So the first is I did select cost category 1. So just a reminder that we always want to include this general operations and management category. I also selected 7 and 8 for the reasons that we discussed earlier. For C, I think this is a really good example of category 10, which I saw someone did just put into the chat, which is private sector engagement, because the way it's described, it sounds like the key priority is strengthening and engaging the connection between the private sector and vocational training centers. And so that's the overarching objective. But I think to Camila's point, if we had some more information that said, you know, we were going to also be working with the government to strengthen, to build their capacity to engage the private sector, then that might fit better under category 3, which is strengthening government systems. So it really requires thinking through a lot of these questions around why are we doing a particular activity. So this isn't to say that these are the only right answers here. You would really want to dive in a little bit deeper and think through the why behind all of your approaches. But hopefully this was a helpful exercise in thinking through how you would select cost categories. And again, that link that I shared, there's a lot more detailed guidance and thinking through. And myself and my colleagues are always also available to help you think through selection of cost categories. All right, and I'm realizing we're a little bit over our time. So if we just jump to the next slide, I'll try to go through the next couple slides fairly quickly to make sure we have some time for discussion. So at this point, you might be wondering, how do we actually do this? How do we go about setting up cost reporting? So there are 5 main steps to do this. I'm not going to go into detail on them now because they are described in a lot more detail in the guidance document. But just so to emphasize a couple points, the first step is, of course, setting up, selecting your cost questions. So what is it that you want to be able to answer from this cost data? Defining that up front will help make sure that your system is set up to answer those questions. So then you would go through selecting your categories, like we just did in that exercise, and any subcategories that you need to include. And documenting then in step 3, all of these decisions that you've made in your cost reporting manual. We see that this is a really key document because the cost reporting work typically involves a lot of different people, from finance teams to management teams to MEL teams. They all really play a role in collecting cost data. So making sure that roles and responsibilities are clearly outlined and decisions that have been made in the cost reporting manual is a really important step. And we have a template for that, which I'm also happy to share. Then you move into training any staff. So for example, staff need to know how they should code their time. And so giving them guidance on how to do that aligned to the guidance. And then finally, doing the reporting on contributions and the details of the intervention. This is the important data that we collect alongside those expenditures. And we'll, again, can share links to some of the templates for that. All right. So if we go to the next slide. So I want to just share a little example from some of our cost analysis work of what we are learning. This is a newer space, and so we have a lot of different studies that are still underway. But I wanted to share one example. This does come from the education sector, but a cross-country cost study that we are just finishing up now and some of the initial insights that we have from this. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So we recently conducted a cross-country cost study that is comparing 8 basic education activities. You can see here the spread of the activities is pretty global. So we have activities from Asia, from the Middle East, and from Africa. And it includes a mix of activities that are national, so reaching across the full scale of the country, and then the remaining ones are subnational. So if we go to the next slide, so the goal of this study was to understand what are the costs, the cost structures, and cost drivers of USAID funded interventions across different activities and contexts. And in particular, trying to understand what are some of the most common interventions in USAID basic education activities. What are some of the cost drivers and contextual factors that seem to really influence costs? And so listed here, you'll see these are the specific categories that we were looking at for this particular intervention. So looking at the development and distribution of teaching and learning materials, teacher support and professional development, capacity development of government and local organizations, and parent and community engagement. So these were some of the common elements that we saw across all of the activities. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into these. So if we go to the next slide, just a little bit more context. So all of these activities in the study used USAID's cost reporting guidance. And this is the guidance that was developed for education programs, and which was the foundation for the PYD cost guidance that we're speaking about today. And so they submitted all of their expenditure data, financial reports, contributions data to the research team. We also spoke with the implementing partners who were involved in each of the activities to make sure we had, a more nuanced understanding of the data that was presented. And so the goal of this study is to serve as a resource for USAID, implementing partners, evaluators who are designing activities, creating and monitoring budgets, and evaluating the cost of activities. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly touch on just one of our findings actually here. There's a little bit more information on the slides, which you all can see, and then the full report will be out soon on EduLinks. You can reach out to me via email if you want to learn more, and I'm happy to share it when it's available. But just to give you a little bit of a taste of what we're seeing here. So one of our questions we wanted to understand was about how much of our total activity costs are associated with general operations and management. So this is that category 1, or the cost of doing business with USAID. And again, this is an important question because these would be costs that would not be incurred if the activity was transitioned to a partner government. And so on average, we saw that these activities spent about 40% of their total costs on general operations and management. And although 40% was the average, we actually saw a huge range here from 26% to 63%. And it's important to note, we're not looking to label this as either good or bad, but more it's just important to know. And so one of the steps that we're still taking as we finalize this analysis is digging deeper into the cost drivers in each of these contexts. So why might we see in some contexts that the number was as low as 26 versus 63? What are some of the reasons that we see that variance? And that will help us really understand more about the cost drivers of USAID funded USAID expenditures in particular. But we can do this for all of the related cost categories. So if you're interested in learning more, you can see that in the full report. But let me jump to a couple slides up. So if we can go to the next slide, we can skip this one for now. We did look at cost of teacher training if you're interested in learning more. But I just want to briefly highlight our resources. So if we go to the next slide, we have a lot of resources available to both USAID missions, implementing partners, and researchers to support this work. So the first link here is to the PYD cost reporting guide. That's the key resource we've been highlighting throughout this webinar, and we'll put it in the chat, which can be found on youthpower.org. The second link is to our EduLinks page, the cost reporting toolkit, which has all of the resources that have been developed to support this work, including templates for collecting all of this data, a field guide, analysis guide, a lot of rich information there. And we'll also have 2 trainings that will be released soon and will be available also on EduLinks. One is an introduction course, Introduction to Cost Measurement, and then one a course made more for evaluators who will actually be doing the cost analysis. And so both of those will be available soon. We have also resources and people available to provide technical assistance. So if you ever have questions about that and are looking for support, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to support or connect you with someone who can. So that was a lot of information. Hopefully this gave you sort of a taste and an interest in the cost reporting work, and helped you start to think through how it might be useful to some of the programs that you support. But I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but maybe if we have time to answer any quick questions. Otherwise, if you do have questions, I'm happy to connect via email. So feel free to reach out to me. But thank you all, and I'll turn it back to Stephanie.
Thank you, Melissa. I do want to ask, I think we have, maybe we can spend 2 or 3 minutes on any burning questions that anyone has. So if you have a question that's coming to mind based on everything that Melissa just shared, please put it in the chat or feel free to come off mute.
Maybe while people are thinking, I also will just plug that we have a cost measurement special interest group, which is open to USAID and external partners, which meets quarterly to share resources and also share experiences with cost measurement. So I'll just put in the chat, there's an email if you're interested in joining that group. We'd love to have you. You can just email, it's educost@usaid.gov.
That's great. Thank you for sharing, Melissa. So we had a question come in from Nancy. So just for the sake of time, I'll read that out. Will USAID be requiring that this cost guidance be included in education-funded MURL plans for future activities?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So currently it is not a requirement. It is a encouraged. As I said, it is a requirement that if you are doing an impact evaluation, you also need to do a cost analysis. Currently, it is not a requirement beyond that. However, we are exploring the possibility of making this a requirement for education-funded programs in the future. That's still sort of in the works right now. And that's also why we're encouraging more activities to do this early on, so that once that guidance or that requirement is in place, that they will be ready to go. And also why we're developing a lot of resources now, and really appreciate sessions like this where we can hear questions from people, because that will help us understand what additional resources and guidance might be needed when it does become a requirement and we see more people are doing it.
Thank you for that, Melissa, and great question. We have just a few minutes left, so I want to take this opportunity to challenge you all to take one of these two actions on the screen. So you just heard about so many great resources, and you might be asking yourself, now what? So we have on this page a couple different things that you can do to learn more or help share these resources with others who might be able to use them. You just had all the links to these great resources that were added in the chat. Maybe think about sharing these on your LinkedIn page. Can reference this webinar and how you just learned about it. You can also share it directly with a colleague who you think might want to know about this or be able to use it in the future. Another great way to learn about this and other resources that are posted about positive youth development is to sign up for the Youth Power newsletter. This comes out on a quarterly basis and summarizes a lot of incredible resources about cost measurement and analysis, as well as many other topics related to positive youth development. So taking two of these things will really help share out these resources, implement them, and keep you in the loop about the latest evidence and tools to be able to do this work. So with that, I just want to say a big thank you to Melissa for walking us through all of this, and to everyone who joined today for this YP2LE Learning Network webinar. We welcome any feedback that you have if you want to send that feedback over email or through Eventbrite. And thank you all. Have a great day ahead.